In the dry plains of northeastern Thailand, there is a village people refuse to speak about after dark. At the edge of the settlement stands a decaying shack that has remained untouched for decades, guarding a coffin that was never buried. The elders say the man inside was never allowed to belong to the dead. They say his body still breathes. And on windless nights, when the earth lies silent as if listening, a knocking sound comes from within. 3 times. Chapter 1. The village beneath the Palmyra shadows. Ban Nong Khe lay far beyond the paved roads, where the red dust of Isan clung to the air and the earth cracked beneath relentless heat. Palmyra palms rose like black spears against a bleached sky, their shadows stretching long and thin across fields that seemed permanently thirsty. Travelers avoided the place after dusk. Even bus drivers refused to stop there once the sun slipped below the horizon. The villagers believed the land remembered things. They believed spirits wandered between the trees when the wind stopped. They believed some deaths did not end. At the farthest edge of the settlement, beyond a dry irrigation canal and a line of termite mounds shaped like crumbling stupas, stood a rotting wooden shack on stilts. Its roof sagged under years of neglect, and strips of faded red cloth fluttered from the beams, stiff with old wax and soot. The door was bound shut with rusted chains and talismans stamped in gold leaf that had long since peeled and curled like dead skin. No one went near it. Children were warned that if they ran too close, the ground beneath the shack would swallow their shadows. Dogs refused to pass along the path that led there. At night, buffalo tethered in distant fields pulled at their ropes and lowed toward the dark silhouette as if sensing a predator no human eye could see. That shack had once belonged to a Jarn Prasit, the village sorcerer. Some said he had healed fevers with whispered charms. Others claimed he could summon spirits to find lost cattle, or curse a man until his rice crop rotted in the field. But as the years passed, the stories darkened. Chickens were found drained of blood. A fisherman drowned in a pond shallow enough to stand in. A newborn fell silent in its sleep. Fear grew faster than truth. Then one humid night thick with the smell of rain that never fell, the villagers dragged Prasit from his shack. They bound his wrists with rope soaked in sacred oil and forced him to kneel beneath the Palmyra trees. No one agreed on what he confessed. Some swore he laughed. Others said he spoke in a voice that did not belong to a living man. By dawn, he was dead, and no one dared bury him. They sealed his body in a rough wooden coffin, wrapped it in red cloth inscribed with protective yantra symbols, and returned it to the shack. Chains were fastened, talismans nailed, monks chanted until their voices broke. Yet on certain nights when the wind died and even insects fell silent, people claimed they heard a hollow knocking from within the sealed hut. 3 slow knocks. Then silence thick enough to feel pressing against the skin. The elders warned, if anyone opened the coffin, the village itself would not survive to see another harvest. So the shack remained, and the land remembered. Chapter 2. The curse spoken with a dying breath. Long before the coffin was sealed and the shack chained shut, the night Jarn Prasit died had already begun to sour the air of Ban Nong Khe. The sky hung low and swollen with unmoving clouds, trapping the heat so that even breathing felt like swallowing warm water. Cicadas screamed from the Palmyra trees, then fell abruptly silent, as though something unseen had passed through the fields and frightened the sound from their bodies. The villagers gathered in tight clusters, oil lamps trembling in their hands. No one wanted to stand too close to the sorcerer, yet no one dared leave. Rope soaked in sacred oil bound his wrists. White thread for protection had been wound around his chest, but the knots trembled, quivering like living things against his skin. Prasit knelt in the dust, head bowed, his tangled hair hanging over his face. Dark streaks marked his cheeks where sweat had carved paths through ash and soot. Someone had smeared holy powder across his forehead, yet beneath it his skin seemed unnaturally gray, not the gray of illness, but the color of something already claimed by death. Confess, the village headman demanded, though his voice shook. Release whatever you have sent among us. Prasit did not answer. A child began to cry. The wind died. Then slowly, with a stiffness that made several villagers recoil, the sorcerer lifted his head. His eyes were open. They reflected no lamplight. A murmur rippled through the crowd. One of the elders began chanting protective verses, his voice cracking as he rushed through sacred syllables. Priscit's lips twitched. At first, it sounded like a cough dragged up from deep inside a collapsing chest. Then it became a laugh, dry, rasping, hollow, like something scraping along the inside of a coffin lid. Several people stumbled backward. The ropes creaked. "You think binding flesh binds what walks beneath it?" he whispered. His voice did not seem to come from his throat. It seemed to seep from the ground, from the trees, from the hollow spaces inside the villagers' own chests. A woman screamed. The headman raised a sacred amulet and shouted for silence. But Priscit continued, each word emerging with wet, rattling breaths. "I will not leave this place." The oil lamps flickered violently. Dogs began howling from the far edges of the fields. "If you bury me," he rasped, lips peeling back to reveal gums dark as rotting fruit, "I will rise beneath your houses." The sacred threads snapped. "If you burn me, I will ride the smoke into your lungs." Someone dropped a lamp. Flames sputtered in the dust. His eyes moved then, not searching, not pleading, but choosing. "And if you leave me unburied?" He smiled. It was not the smile of a living man. "I will wait." A sudden gust of wind rushed across the fields, flattening the grass. Lamps extinguished. Darkness swallowed the crowd. When light returned, Priscit had collapsed forward into the dirt. Dead. No breath. No pulse. But the soil beneath his body was warm, as if something below the surface had been waiting to receive him. No one spoke for a long time. Then, without discussion, without prayer, without even the courage to look directly at the corpse, the villagers made their decision. They would not bury him. They would not burn him. They would seal him away and pray that waiting was enough. From the Palmyra shadows beyond the fields, something answered with 3 hollow knocks carried on the wind.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.
Chapter 3. The Shack That Breathes. By sunrise, the villagers of Ban Non K moved like people performing a ritual they did not dare question. No one spoke Priscit's name. Even whispering it felt like inviting attention from something that listened beneath the soil. 4 men were chosen to prepare the body. They wrapped strips of cloth around their mouths and soaked their hands in blessed water until their skin puckered white. The monks burned incense so thick the air turned bitter. But the sweet smoke could not mask the odor rising from the corpse, not the smell of decay. But something damp and ancient, like soil sealed away for centuries suddenly exposed to air. Priscit's body was stiff, yet strangely heavy, as though the weight of wet earth clung to his bones. When they lifted him, dark fluid seeped from his nostrils and ears, soaking into the mat beneath him. One of the men gagged and nearly dropped the corpse. "Do not let him touch the ground," an elder whispered hoarsely. "Not again." They placed him inside a rough coffin hastily built from termite-eaten planks. The wood groaned as if resisting the burden. His body was wrapped in red cloth marked with protective yantra symbols. The ink thick and uneven where trembling hands had drawn sacred lines meant to bind what could not be seen. A strip of gold leaf bearing holy script was pressed across his lips. It curled and blackened within seconds. No one spoke of it. The coffin lid was forced shut and sealed with nails hammered through strips of sacred thread. Each strike echoed unnaturally loud across the silent fields. Birds did not sing. Even the wind seemed to wait. When they lifted the coffin, something thudded from inside. The men froze. No one dared open it. They carried it to the shack. Ajarn Priscit's shack stood alone at the edge of the village. Its stilts sunk crookedly into cracked earth. Red talismans hung from the beams, stiff with wax drippings and smoke stains from rituals long past. Beneath the floorboards lay dark patches where offerings had once been burned, or where something had seeped upward. The door resisted when they pushed it open. A sour breath of air exhaled from within, warm and damp, brushing across their faces like something alive. Inside, the light seemed to vanish before reaching the walls. The interior swallowed brightness, leaving only dim shapes. A low altar crusted with melted candle wax. Jars filled with murky liquid. Bundles of bone and twine hanging from rafters. and symbols scratched into the wood so deeply the grooves had split the grain. They placed the coffin at the center of the room. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a soft sound emerged from the sealed box. Not movement. Not scratching. A slow, hollow tap. One of the men stumbled backward, knocking over a clay bowl. It shattered with a crack that seemed to echo far too long. "Seal it," the elder ordered. They nailed red cloth across the doorframe. Golden talismans were fixed above the entrance. Chains were wrapped around the door handles and secured with iron locks brought from the temple storeroom. Monks chanted until their voices frayed into hoarse whispers. Blessed water was thrown across the walls. Sacred ash was scattered beneath the floor. When the final prayer ended, the silence that followed felt heavy, as though the shack itself were holding its breath. That night, the villagers barred their doors and kept their lamps burning until dawn. Sometime deep in the hours when even insects rest, a sound traveled across the still air from the far edge of the village. A hollow knock. Then another. Then a third. The sound did not echo. It sank into the earth. In the morning, 3 damp handprints were found pressed into the dust outside the sealed shack door, as if something inside had tested the barrier and then withdrawn. From that day forward, no one walked the path past the shack after sunset. Yet sometimes, when the wind stopped and the night pressed close, villagers swore they heard a faint, slow breathing drifting from within the walls, as though the sealed room itself had lungs, and something inside it was patiently learning how to use them. Chapter 4. The Man Who Returned from the City. 12 years passed, and Ban Nong K did what forgotten places do. It endured in silence. The rice still grew thin in the cracked earth. The Palmyra palms still cast long skeletal shadows across the fields, and the shack at the edge of the village continued to lean toward collapse without ever falling. People stopped speaking about Ajarn Prasid aloud. Children grew into adults who pretended not to believe the stories told to frighten them when they were young. Yet no one walked the path beyond the dry canal after sunset. No one allowed their livestock to graze near the termite mounds that marked the boundary between the living village and the land that waited. Then Anon returned. He arrived on a late afternoon bus coated in red dust from the highway, stepping down with a suitcase in one hand and a phone in the other, its bright screen glowing like a small piece of another world. Bangkok had sharpened his posture and thinned his patience. The village smelled smaller than he remembered: smoke, stagnant water, dried fish, and something faintly metallic beneath it all. Women whispered when they saw him. Men nodded but avoided his eyes. He had come to sell his parents' land. After their deaths, there was nothing here for him except paperwork and memories he preferred to keep buried beneath concrete and traffic noise. As he walked toward the old family house, he noticed the silence first. Not the peaceful quiet of countryside evenings, but a stillness that felt deliberate, as if the air itself were listening. Then he saw it. Beyond the fields, past the brittle line of scrub trees, the silhouette of a shack stood on crooked stilts against the sinking sun. Strips of faded red cloth hung from its beams, stirring though no wind touched the surrounding grass. A smell drifted toward him. Faint. Sweet. Rotting. Anon wrinkled his nose and looked away. Still standing, he muttered, remembering half-forgotten stories told by his grandmother, warnings meant to keep children close to home at night. He laughed under his breath. City life had burned superstition out of him. Ghost stories belonged to people who had never seen elevators climb 40 floors or traffic lights hold back rivers of steel. Inside the house, dust lay thick across the wooden floorboards. He opened windows, letting the evening air crawl in. The light dimmed quickly, swallowed by gathering clouds that turned the sky the color of bruised flesh. As night settled, he noticed something else. No insects hummed outside. No frogs called from the irrigation ditch. Even the dogs had fallen silent. He sat at the table scrolling through property listings, trying to ignore the sensation pressing at the back of his neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. From the direction of the fields, a dull metallic sound carried across the dark. He paused. Listened. Nothing. A few minutes later, it came again. A hollow knock. He told himself it was wood shifting in the cooling air. Old structures settle. They creak. They contract. He returned to his phone. The third knock came louder. Closer. The screen in his hand flickered. The lights went out. Anon sat in darkness, the afterimage of the glowing screen burning in his vision. Somewhere beyond the walls, the wind began to move through the Palmyra leaves with a dry, whispering hiss. Then, from far across the fields where the shack stood unseen in the dark, something answered the silence with a slow, deliberate sound. Knock. 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 The noise did not echo. It seemed to arrive already inside the room. Anon forced a laugh and reached for a flashlight, unaware that outside, in the thin dust coating the front steps, a single wet footprint had appeared, pointing toward the door. And beside it, the faint impression of another, as if something had paused there, deciding whether to enter.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.
Chapter 5. The First Night's Knocking. The darkness inside the house felt heavier than it should have, thick and unmoving, as though the air itself had turned to damp cloth. Anon found his flashlight by touch alone. When the beam snapped on, its narrow cone of light seemed swallowed by the corners of the room rather than pushing the dark away. He exhaled a shaky laugh. Power outage, he muttered to no one. Old wiring, that's all. Yet the silence pressing against the walls felt too complete. Even during blackouts in Bangkok, there had always been noise, traffic, distant voices, the pulse of a city refusing to sleep. Here, there was nothing. No insects, no frogs, no wind, just the faint creak of cooling wood and the dull thud of his own heartbeat. Then came the sound again. Knock. It came from the front door. He froze, flashlight trembling in his hand. A second knock followed, heavier, deliberate, not the quick tapping of knuckles, but a hollow, resonant thud, as though wood struck wood. The beam of light drifted across the room and settled on the door. Dust floated in the air like pale ash. Knock. The third strike vibrated through the frame and into the floorboards beneath his feet. Anon swallowed, forcing irritation to replace the cold tightening in his chest. Someone from the village, he told himself. A prank, a test to see if the man from the city still believed in childhood ghost stories. He stepped forward and pulled the door open. The night stood empty before him. Moonlight seeped through thin clouds, painting the yard in a dull, colorless glow. The dirt path lay undisturbed. The Palmyra trees beyond the field stood motionless against the sky. No one there, he whispered. But when he lowered the flashlight beam, his breath caught. Wet footprints marked the dust at the threshold. Not the dry impressions left by sandals. These were dark, damp shapes, as if made by bare feet freshly lifted from mud. The water glistened briefly before soaking into the powdery earth. One footprint, then another. They led away from the door, not toward it. Anon's skin prickled. He stepped onto the threshold, shining the light outward. The prints continued across the yard, each one spaced with slow, deliberate steps. A faint odor rose from them, sour and earthy, like stagnant water trapped beneath rotting leaves. The trail moved toward the fields, toward the dark silhouette at the village's edge. He should have closed the door. He should have locked it and returned to bed. Instead, he followed. The soil beyond the yard grew colder beneath his bare feet. The prints sank deeper as they crossed the dry canal, where a thin ribbon of black mud glistened in the beam of his flashlight. The smell intensified, thick and damp, coating the back of his throat. Halfway across the fields, the beam flickered. The air felt cooler here, unnaturally so, raising gooseflesh along his arms. The shack stood ahead, leaning against the horizon like a broken tooth. Strips of red cloth hung stiff from its beams. The chains across the door glinted faintly in the weak light. The footprints ended at the base of the steps. Anon lifted the beam toward the door. The chains were still in place. The talismans hung unmoving. Yet the wood of the door looked darker near the bottom, swollen as if recently soaked. He listened. For several seconds, there was nothing. Then, from inside the sealed shack, came a slow, dragging sound, like fabric shifting over rough wood. Anon stepped back. The beam trembled violently now. A faint breath of warm air drifted through the cracks in the boards, carrying with it the unmistakable odor of wet earth and something older, something sealed too long in darkness. Then the sound came. Not from the door, not from the walls, but from within the shack itself. A hollow knock. Anon staggered backward. Before he could turn to run, the flashlight died, plunging him into a darkness so complete it felt solid against his eyes. Behind him, across the empty fields, the path back to the house had vanished into blackness. And in the silence that followed, he heard a slow inhalation, deep, patient, and close enough that the back of his neck tingled with the warmth of it. As though something inside the shack had drawn breath and recognized his scent. Chapter 6. The Woman Without a Shadow. Anon did not remember running back across the fields. One moment he stood in suffocating darkness before the sealed shack. The next he found himself gripping the wooden frame of his doorway. Lungs burning, shirt soaked in cold sweat. His flashlight hung useless in his hand. Its lens cracked, its batteries drained as if the light had been consumed rather than extinguished. He slammed the door shut and slid the bolt into place. Only then did he notice his feet. They were coated in black mud. The smell followed him inside. He washed them again and again at the basin, scrubbing until his skin reddened. Yet the sour odor lingered faintly beneath the scent of soap. He told himself it was only swamp soil, stagnant water, the natural rot of rural land. But when he lay down, sleep refused him. The silence outside pressed against the walls. No insects sang, no night birds called. Even the Palmyra leaves seemed frozen in the air. Sometime near dawn, exhaustion dragged him into a shallow, uneasy sleep. He dreamed of breathing earth. He woke to knocking. Not loud, not violent. Just 3 slow taps against the wooden door. His heart lurched into a sprint. He lay motionless, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound to come again. It did not. Pale morning light seeped through the window gaps. Roosters crowed in the distance, their voices hesitant, as though unsure the sun had truly returned. Anon forced himself upright and unlatched the door. A woman stood in the yard. She was thin and stooped, her gray hair bound in a loose knot at the nape of her neck. A faded indigo blouse hung from her narrow shoulders, and her sarong brushed the tops of her bare feet, which were dusted white with powdery soil. She did not appear to have approached. She stood as if she had always been there. "You went to the shack," she said. Her voice was soft but carried easily in the still air. Anon frowned. "Everyone knows about that place." Her eyes did not blink. "Did you look inside?" He hesitated. Something in her gaze felt wrong, not hostile, not kind, but empty in a way that made words feel dangerous. "I didn't open anything," he said. The woman's lips tightened. "Do not look into the coffin," she whispered. A breeze stirred the edge of her sarong. The air grew cooler, brushing against his damp skin like fingers just lifted from water. "Why?" he asked. Her head tilted slightly, as if listening to something behind him. "Because once it sees you," she murmured, "it will know where to return." Anon opened his mouth to ask what she meant, but the woman had already turned away. She walked toward the dirt path without haste, her steps soundless. The morning light stretched long across the ground, casting shadows from the house posts, the water jar, the crooked fence. But not from her. Anon's breath caught. The sunlight passed through her feet and touched the earth beyond, leaving no dark shape, no outline, nothing to anchor her to the ground she crossed. He stepped forward. "Wait." She did not stop. She moved toward the far end of the path where the termite mounds rose like broken teeth from the soil. The air around her seemed to blur faintly, as though heat shimmered around a distant fire. Then she was gone. No turn in the path. No obstruction. Just empty air and the brittle whisper of dry grass. Anon stood motionless for a long time. Behind him, from inside the house, something gave a soft, dull tap, like wood settling under a shifting weight. He turned slowly. The door he had left open now stood closed. Mud darkened the threshold. And beside it, faint but unmistakable, lay the impression of 3 damp footprints facing inward. As if something had stood at the doorway, waiting for permission to enter.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.
Chapter 7. The Coffin's Breath. All morning, Anand tried to convince himself he had imagined the woman. Grief, exhaustion, unfamiliar silence, the mind could twist such things into shapes that felt real. He boiled water, swept dust from the floor, opened every window to let sunlight flood the rooms. The ordinary sounds of movement inside the house slowly returned, the scrape of wood, the creak of beams warming in daylight, the clink of a cup against enamel. Yet something remained wrong. The air inside still held a faint dampness, like soil sealed too long away from light. And though the sun burned high above the fields, the smell of wet earth lingered at the threshold. He avoided looking at the footprints. By afternoon, heat pressed down so heavily that the horizon wavered in liquid distortions. The village seemed almost normal in daylight. A motorbike rattled past. Women spread rice to dry on woven mats. Children's laughter drifted from somewhere beyond the houses, then, cautious, as if unsure joy was permitted. No one spoke to him about the shack. But he noticed how their eyes flicked toward the fields whenever a breeze stirred. As evening approached, clouds gathered low and heavy, muting the sunset into bruised shades of violet and rust. The knowing silence returned with the falling light. Birds vanished from the sky. Dogs retreated beneath houses and did not emerge. Anand told himself he would not go back. He boiled instant noodles and ate without tasting them. He turned on his phone for distraction, but the signal flickered and died. When darkness thickened beyond the windows, he lit a candle and set it on the table. The flame bent sideways, though the air was still. He blew it out and sat in darkness, listening. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, faintly, so faintly he thought it might be memory, came a hollow sound drifting across the fields. Knock. His jaw tightened. He stood, walked to the door, and forced himself to remain there, breathing slowly. Knock. Closer. Knock. He opened the door before the third sound fully faded, as though confronting it might strip the fear from it. The yard lay empty beneath a thin wash of moonlight. But the smell returned immediately, damp soil, stagnant water, and something sweet rotting beneath it. He looked down. Fresh footprints marked the dust again. Dark, wet, bare. They faced away from the house. He should have closed the door. Instead, he followed. The night air cooled sharply as he crossed the dry canal. Grass brushed his ankles with a brittle whisper. The prints glistened faintly, guiding him through the fields toward the silhouette waiting at the village's edge. The shack seemed larger in darkness. The red cloth talismans hung stiff as dried skin. Chains bound the door. The wood appeared swollen, darkened near the base as though moisture seeped from within. The footprints ended at the steps. Anand climbed. The wood did not creak beneath his weight. He raised his hand toward the door, not to touch it, only to feel the air. Warmth seeped through the cracks. Not the warmth of trapped heat. The warmth of breath. He froze. From inside came a slow, dragging sound, like fabric shifting across rough planks. Something brushed the inner surface of the coffin lid, a dull, padded scrape. Anand's throat tightened. He leaned closer despite himself. The smell intensified, thick and damp, coating the back of his tongue. Then he heard it. Breathing. Slow, measured, patient. Each inhalation seemed to draw air through the cracks in the wood, as though the sealed room itself possessed lungs. Each exhale brushed faint warmth against his cheek. The coffin was inside. The lid was sealed. Nothing living could remain. Yet the breath continued. Anand staggered backward, striking the hanging talismans. They swung violently, clattering against the door. Inside the shack, the breathing stopped. Silence fell so suddenly it roared in his ears. Then, a hollow knock erupted from within the coffin, so loud it vibrated through the door and into his bones. He stumbled down the steps, nearly falling into the dust. The air behind him seemed to thicken, pressing against his back as though urging him to return. He did not stop running until he reached his house. He slammed the door, dropped the bolt, and leaned his full weight against the wood, lungs heaving. Outside, the wind rose at last. rushing through the Palmyra leaves with a dry, whispering hiss. Inside the darkness behind him, something shifted. A faint tapping sounded from the wall nearest his bed. Not loud, not urgent, just 3 slow knocks, as if something had followed him home, and was now learning the shape of the room. Chapter 8. Eyes that refused to rot. Anon did not sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed with his back pressed to the wall, staring into the darkness where the faint tapping had come from. The sound had stopped almost immediately, leaving behind a silence so dense it felt padded, like cloth stuffed into the ears of the world. He told himself it had been wood settling. Old houses breathe at night. They contract, expand, release the heat of day. But the wall beside his bed still smelled faintly of wet soil. Dawn came slowly, a pale gray light seeping through the slats of the window. The moment the first rooster crowed, the pressure inside the room seemed to lift. Sound returned in hesitant fragments, a motorbike in the distance, a metal basin struck by accident, a child calling to another across the lane. Daylight made everything feel explainable. Almost. Anon washed his face, avoiding the mirror. The skin beneath his eyes had darkened. Fine lines of gray dust clung to his nostrils, though he had not left the house since the night before. He decided he would leave the village within 2 days. Sell the land quickly, return to Bangkok, forget this place and its stagnant air. He stepped outside to breathe. Morning sun warmed the yard, but the earth near the threshold remained darker than the surrounding soil. Damp as if recently turned. The faint outline of footprints lingered there, already fading into powder. He looked toward the fields. The shack stood motionless at the horizon. A thought surfaced, unwelcome and persistent. If the coffin is sealed, what is breathing inside it? He spent the day trying not to answer. But by late afternoon, curiosity had sharpened into something harder to resist. It was not belief, he told himself that firmly, but the need to expose the trick behind a performance. There would be a rational explanation: trapped gases, animals nesting within the structure, moisture swelling the wood. The dead do not breathe. The dead do not knock. As the sun dipped low, he found himself walking toward the dry canal again. The air cooled with unnatural speed. Grass brushed his ankles. No insects stirred. The shack waited. The chains remained intact. The talismans hung unmoving. Yet the smell reached him before he climbed the steps: damp earth, rot, and something faintly sweet beneath it, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. He stood before the door, heart hammering. Just a look, he whispered. His fingers touched the wood. It was warm. Not sun-warmed. Body-warm. The door creaked inward with a long, reluctant groan. The interior swallowed the fading daylight. Darkness pooled in the corners like liquid shadow. The altar crusted with wax stood against one wall. Its melted candles warped into shapes resembling twisted limbs. Bundles of bone and twine swayed faintly though no breeze entered. The coffin rested at the center of the room. Its lid was no longer fully sealed. A narrow gap split the seam. Anon's breath slowed to a thin thread. He stepped closer. The smell intensified: wet soil, stagnant water, and something unmistakably organic beneath it. He told himself he would look only once. He leaned forward. Through the gap, he saw gray skin stretched tight across a face that should have collapsed into decay years ago. The flesh had not rotted. It had tightened, shrunk, and hardened, clinging to bone like parchment. The lips were dark and pulled back slightly from the teeth. The eyes were open. Not clouded. Not collapsed. They were wet. They reflected the faint light entering through the doorway. They were looking straight at him. Anon jerked backward, striking the altar. Wax fragments shattered against the floor. The bundles hanging from the rafters began to sway, knocking softly against one another like teeth chattering in cold. The corpse did not move. The eyes did not blink. Yet something changed. Moisture gathered at the corners of those unrotted eyes, glistening like fresh tears. Behind him, the door slammed shut. Darkness engulfed the shack. Anon lunged forward, hands outstretched, striking the coffin. The wood vibrated beneath his palms. From inside, Warm air pushed through the narrow gap, brushing his fingers with a breath that smelled of damp soil and ancient confinement. Then, inches from his face, a whisper slid through the darkness. "You saw me." The coffin shuddered. A hollow knock exploded from within. The sound struck his chest like a physical blow. He screamed and hurled himself toward where he remembered the door, slamming into it with his shoulder. The chains rattled, the wood resisted, then burst open beneath his weight. He fell down the steps into the dust, choking on night air that felt suddenly thin and cold. Behind him, the shack stood silent once more. The door hung slightly ajar. From within its darkness, something pale lingered in the gap, not moving, not emerging, simply present, watching. Anon staggered to his feet and ran. He did not look back. But all the way across the fields, he felt the pressure of a gaze fixed between his shoulder blades. And long after he barred his door and collapsed against it, he could still see them when he closed his eyes. Wet, unrotted, waiting.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.
Chapter 9. The breath behind his neck. Anon bolted the door with shaking hands and dragged a wooden chair beneath the handle. Though he knew wood and iron meant nothing against whatever he had seen. His lungs burned as if he had run miles instead of crossing a single field. Sweat cooled on his skin, leaving him shivering despite the humid night. Inside the house, the darkness felt crowded. He lit a candle. The flame sprang up eagerly, then bent sideways, as if air were being drawn past it toward the rear wall. He turned slowly. Nothing stood behind him. Yet the smell of damp soil lingered, faint but unmistakable. He pressed his palms to his eyes, willing the image away. Gray skin, blackened lips, and those wet, unrotted eyes fixed on his own. "You saw me." The whisper still clung to his ears. He did not remember lying down, only that sometime later he found himself curled on the bed, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling beams while the candle guttered into a stub of hardened wax. The village outside remained unnaturally silent. No insects. No dogs. No wind. Near midnight, the temperature inside the room dropped sharply. His breath misted faintly in the air, though this part of Thailand never knew such cold. Goose flesh rippled along his arms. Then came the sensation. Warmth at the back of his neck. A slow exhale. Anon froze. The breath came again, damp, measured, patient, stirring the fine hairs at his nape. He did not turn. His pulse thundered so loudly he feared it might drown out whatever stood behind him. Another breath. Closer. The smell flooded his senses now, wet earth, stagnant water, and something sweet rotting beneath it. A whisper brushed the shell of his ear. "Your house remembers the ground." His muscles convulsed. He spun around, striking blindly at the air. Nothing stood there. The room was empty. The candle flame burned straight and still. He stumbled backward, chest heaving, until his shoulders struck the wall. His gaze darted across the floorboards. Dark smudges marked the wood beside the bed. Mud. 3 damp footprints faced inward. He stared at them as they slowly darkened the grain, moisture seeping into the wood as though absorbed by thirsty fibers. A dull thud sounded from beneath the floor. He flinched. Another thud followed, heavier, as if something had shifted in the crawl space below the house. Then came a slow dragging sound beneath him, moving from one end of the room to the other. Dust sifted down between the floorboards. He leapt off the bed. The dragging stopped. Silence fell. Seconds passed. Then, knock. The sound came from below. Knock. Directly beneath his feet. Knock. The floorboards trembled faintly, the vibration traveling up through his bones. Anon staggered backward, his heel striking the wall. A hairline crack split the plaster, and a thin line of black soil trickled out, sprinkling onto the floor like dry sand escaping a grave. He stared in horror. The crack widened. From within it seeped the same damp, earthen smell he had breathed inside the shack. A soft sound rose from beneath the house, not movement, not scratching, but breathing. Slow, measured, patient, as if something below the floor had found him. and was listening to his heartbeat. Anon grabbed his phone with trembling hands. No signal, no light. The screen flickered and died as if drained by an unseen current. The breathing continued. He backed toward the door, never taking his eyes off the widening crack in the wall. Mud seeped through it in dark veins. The wooden boards beneath his feet felt faintly warm, as though heat rose from the soil below. Behind him, the bolt rattled. He froze. The door trembled once, lightly, as if touched from the outside. Then came 3 slow knocks. From the other side, he stood trapped between 2 sounds, the breathing beneath the floor and the knocking at the door. The candle flame guttered violently, then went out. Darkness swallowed the room. In the blackness, something shifted beneath the house, a long, wet movement pressing upward against the boards. And at the door, the 3rd knock sounded louder than the others. Not asking to be let in, but announcing it had arrived. Chapter 10. The House That Breathes the Dead. Anon stood motionless in the dark, caught between the door and the floor, between the knocking that had come from outside and the breathing rising from beneath the boards. The silence that followed the final knock felt swollen, as if the night itself were holding its breath in anticipation. He did not move. He did not speak. He listened. At first there was nothing, only the slow hammering of his heart and the faint ringing in his ears. Then the wooden boards beneath his feet gave a soft, fibrous creak, like wet wood bending under pressure. The sound traveled across the room, stopping directly beneath where he stood. Warmth seeped upward through the soles of his feet. Not heat. Body warmth. He lurched backward. The floorboards sagged slightly where he had been standing, bowing inward as if something heavy pressed against them from below. A thin line split between 2 planks, and from the darkness within leaked a breath of air thick with damp soil and the sweet, cloying scent of rot. Then came the inhalation. Slow. Deep. Drawn through the crack in the floor. The house shuddered faintly, its beams emitting a low groan that resonated through the walls like a living throat vibrating with sound. Anon stumbled toward the door and yanked the bolt free. The wood resisted, swollen and damp beneath his palm. When he finally forced it open, cold night air rushed in, thin and metallic. The yard lay empty. Moonlight washed the ground in pale gray, revealing no footprints, no movement, no sign of the knocking that had summoned him. Behind him, the boards creaked again. He turned. The candle stub on the table trembled though no flame remained. Dust sifted from the ceiling beams in thin, steady threads. The widening seam in the floor exhaled another breath of wet air. Each pulse timed like the lungs of something buried but not dead. The house was breathing. A soft thud sounded beneath the far wall. Then another. Slow movement traveled beneath the structure, displacing soil with a wet, dragging sound. The vibration passed from one support post to the next, as though something long and heavy crawled through the earth, mapping the house from below. Anon's throat tightened. "Leave," he whispered to himself. But his legs did not move. From beneath the floor came a hollow knock. It echoed up through the boards and into his bones. Another knock answered from somewhere beyond the fields. Then a third from the direction of the shack. The sounds aligned, not separate, but connected, as though the earth itself carried the signal between them. Knock. 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 The floor seam widened with a brittle crack. Black soil pushed through in damp clumps. The smell surged upward, filling his lungs with the odor of graves opened too soon. Then, from the darkness below, came a whisper that did not pass through air but through the wood itself. Vibrating into his feet. The ground remembers every body. Anon staggered back, striking the table. The candle rolled off and shattered on the floor. The house gave another shudder. Deeper this time, its stilts sinking a fraction into the softened earth. Outside, the wind rose suddenly, rattling the palm leaves in a dry, frantic hiss. Inside, the breathing continued. Slow. Measured. Patient. Mud seeped further through the cracks, spreading across the boards in dark veins that branched toward the walls like roots seeking water. The wood darkened as the moisture spread, as though the house were being reclaimed from below. Another movement passed beneath him, closer now. Directly under the doorway. The threshold lifted slightly, then settled with a dull, heavy thud. Anon felt it then, not vibration, not sound, but a tension, a vast, patient awareness beneath the soil, pressing upward as though testing the thin barrier between flesh and earth. From the open doorway, the night yawned wide and silent. From beneath the house, something exhaled. Warm air curled around his ankles. And in that breath, layered beneath the stench of wet soil and decay, he recognized another scent. Old incense, burnt wax, and the faint sweetness of flowers left before a coffin. Behind him, the floorboards knocked once more. This time, from directly beneath where his bed stood. As if something below had found the place where he slept, and was learning the shape of his body.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.
Chapter 11. The Charm Beneath the Floor. Anon did not remember deciding to lift the floorboards. The thought arrived fully formed, as if placed into his mind during one of the long, breathless pauses between the house's slow inhalations. The seam in the wood had widened overnight. Mud had dried along the edges in dark veins, and the faint smell of damp soil lingered even in the daylight heat. Morning should have brought relief. Instead, the silence felt heavier. The villagers moved through their routines with lowered voices and careful steps. No one lingered near his house. A dog approached the yard, stopped abruptly, and retreated with its tail tucked low between its legs. The ground remembers every body. The whisper returned with the memory of breath against his neck. He fetched a rusted crowbar from the shed behind the house. The metal felt hot in his hands, though it had been shaded from the sun. Sweat ran down his spine as he returned inside and stood over the warped planks beside his bed. For several seconds he hesitated. Then he wedged the crowbar into the seam and pried. The wood resisted with a damp, fibrous groan before tearing upward in splintered fragments. A wave of cold, earthen air surged from the darkness below, carrying the odor of wet clay, mold, and something faintly sweet and putrid beneath it. He gagged and turned his face aside. Beneath the floor lay not open space, but packed soil, dark, damp, and recently disturbed. It glistened faintly in the dim light, as though moisture still seeped upward from deeper layers. He knelt and brushed away loose dirt. His fingers struck cloth. He froze. The fabric was stiff with age and stained a deep rust red. Carefully, he pulled it free from the soil. The bundle was wrapped in faded thread tied in ritual knots, each loop sealed with hardened wax stamped with yantra symbols. The moment the bundle cleared the hole, the house gave a faint shudder. Dust sifted from the beams. The air grew colder. Anon swallowed and untied the thread. Inside lay a folded strip of yellowed cloth inked with protective script. Brittle strands of human hair bound with black thread, and a thin copper amulet etched with geometric patterns worn nearly smooth by time. He turned the cloth over. On the reverse side, written in faded charcoal strokes, were words in an unsteady hand. "Do not let him be buried." Anon's breath shortened. The air around him seemed to thicken, pressing against his chest. He examined the amulet. Its surface was cold, unnaturally cold, despite the heat pressing down on the village. As his thumb traced the etched lines, a faint vibration passed through the metal, subtle as the tremor of distant thunder. The house creaked. From the open space beneath the floor came a slow inhalation, deeper than before, drawing air across the exposed soil with a soft, dragging whisper. Anon jerked his hand away. The bundle slipped from his grip and struck the boards. A hollow knock answered from below. He stared at the hole. The dark soil within had shifted. Not collapsed. Moved. As if something beneath had turned toward the opening. He backed away on trembling legs. The copper amulet spun slowly where it had fallen, its etched surface catching a thin line of light. The strands of hair quivered though no breeze entered the room. Then, from the hole beneath the floor, warm air rose in a slow exhale that smelled of wet earth and extinguished incense. The boards around the opening creaked, bending inward slightly, as though the ground beneath them were softening. From deep below came a sound like wood struck from within the earth. A hollow knock. Another answered from the direction of the fields. a third from somewhere impossibly close, within the walls themselves. The amulet vibrated. The strands of hair twitched, curling slightly as if drawn toward the darkness below. Anon snatched the bundle and stumbled backward, clutching it against his chest. The breathing stopped. Silence collapsed over the house. For several seconds, nothing moved. Then a thin line split the plaster beside the doorway. Black grains of soil trickled from it, sprinkling onto the floor like dry rain. The whisper came again, not through the air, but through the wood, the walls, the bones of the house itself. If he is buried, he will rise. Anon staggered toward the door, the bundle clutched in his hands. Outside, the sky had darkened though the sun had not yet set. The wind had died. And far beyond the fields, the crooked silhouette of the shack stood waiting, its red talismans hanging stiff and unmoving, as though even the air had learned not to touch them. Chapter 12. The monk who would not speak loudly. The bundle felt heavier with every step Anon took toward the old temple at the edge of the village. The copper amulet inside seemed to pulse faintly against his palm, as though warmed by a heartbeat not his own. Above him, the sky hung low and colorless, pressing down on the land with the weight of an approaching storm that never broke. Ban Nong K's temple stood older than memory. Its whitewashed walls had peeled into scales, revealing brick the color of dried blood beneath. Prayer flags hung in faded strips from the eaves, unmoving in the still air. The bell rope swayed slightly though no wind stirred. Anon climbed the cracked steps. Inside, incense smoke lingered in thin, unmoving ribbons. The air was cooler here, but not clean. Beneath the fragrance of sandalwood lay a faint dampness, like robes dried too slowly in shadow. At the far end of the hall sat the village's last remaining monk. Fra Cruz Samchai had not left the temple grounds in years. His skin hung loosely on his bones, and his eyelids drooped as though the weight of sight had grown too heavy. Yet when Anon approached, the monk's eyes opened fully, sharp, alert, and filled with something deeper than age. "You opened the ground," the monk said quietly. It was not a question. Anon swallowed. "I found this." He placed the bundle on the floor between them and unfolded the cloth. The monk did not touch it. His gaze lingered on the strands of hair, the yellowed script, the copper amulet etched with protective geometry worn smooth by decades of handling. The incense smoke twisted. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally, the monk inhaled slowly and said, almost in a whisper, "That was buried to keep him from being buried." Anon's throat tightened. They left him in the shack because of a curse. They left him because of a prison. The monk corrected softly. Outside, a dry leaf scraped across stone. The body holds the binding. The monk continued. The flesh anchors the spirit. As long as it remains between earth and fire, he cannot pass fully into either world. Anon felt the room tilt slightly. "If we bury him," he said, forcing the words out, "we end this." The monk's gaze sharpened. "If you bury him," he said, "the soil will claim him. Roots, worms, darkness, these belong to the earth. He will travel through them. He will rise wherever the ground is soft enough to breathe." Anon's pulse pounded in his ears. "Then we burn him." The monk closed his eyes. "If you burn him, the binding flesh becomes smoke. Smoke enters lungs. Smoke enters blood. He will not need to rise." The temple bell gave a faint metallic tremor. No hand had touched the rope. Anon's fingers tightened around his knees. "Then what is left?" The monk's voice fell even lower. To leave him unburied was to trap him between worlds. To wait, to starve what clung to the body. His eyelids fluttered open again, and for the first time, fear showed plainly in them. But the waiting has been broken. The copper amulet on the floor gave a faint metallic tick. Anon stared at it. The strands of hair curled inward slightly, as if reacting to unseen heat. "What happens now?" he whispered. The monk's lips moved in silent prayer before he answered. "Now he breathes." A faint gust passed through the hall, stirring the incense smoke into twisting spirals. The smell of damp soil slipped beneath the sandalwood fragrance, subtle but unmistakable. From somewhere deep beneath the temple floor came a dull, hollow sound. Knock. Both men froze. Another knock answered from far beyond the fields. A third sounded so faint it might have come from within Anand's own chest. The monk reached forward at last and pressed his fingertips lightly against the copper amulet. His hand trembled violently. "It is moving through the ground," he whispered, learning the paths between bodies and earth. Anand felt cold spread through his limbs despite the heat pressing outside. "How do we stop it?" The monk withdrew his hand as if burned. "You do not stop a thing that has already learned your breath." The temple darkened as clouds smothered the sun. Wind moved through the prayer flags at last, but instead of fluttering, they twisted slowly around their cords as though tightening. The monk's voice dropped to a final whisper. "Pray that it chooses only one body." The air in the hall grew colder. From beneath the stone floor, something exhaled, a slow, patient breath rising through ancient cracks. And in that breath drifted the faint scent of burnt wax and flowers left before the dead.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.
Chapter 13. The Corpse That Walked the Fields. By the time Anand left the temple, the sky had dimmed into a dull metallic gray. Though the sun had not yet set, the air pressed down with suffocating heaviness, as if the storm clouds hovering above the plains had forgotten how to release rain. Even the distant Palmyra trees stood unnaturally still, their fronds frozen against the sky. The monk's final words clung to him like damp cloth. "Pray that it chooses only one body." The bundle felt colder now. Not cool, cold, like metal left in deep shade. As he walked back toward the village, he noticed doors closing, wooden shutters slid into place. A woman gathering laundry abandoned her basket and hurried inside without meeting his eyes. Somewhere in the distance, a baby began crying, then abruptly stopped, as if the sound had been cut short. The silence returned. Then came the dogs. One began to howl from the far edge of the fields. Another answered. Within seconds, the sound spread across the village, not barking, not warning, but long, wavering cries filled with raw animal panic. Anand turned toward the sound. Beyond the dry canal, where the rice fields stretched pale and brittle toward the horizon, something moved between the rows. At first he thought it was a farmer walking home late. Then the shape lurched. It did not walk. It dragged. The figure moved with stiff, uneven motions, one leg pulling slightly behind the other. Its arms hung at its sides. Fingers curved inward as though stiffened by rigor. Each step seemed deliberate, slow, and tireless, not the gait of a living body, but of something forcing movement through unyielding flesh. The dog's howling rose into a frenzy. Anand felt the air grow colder against his skin. The figure reached the shallow canal and stepped down into the black mud. The wet soil did not splash. It seemed to receive the foot, swallowing it to the ankle before releasing it with a slow, sucking sound. The smell reached him next. Wet earth, stagnant water, and beneath it, the faint sweetness of rot. The figure climbed the opposite bank. Moonlight slipped through the clouds for a single pale moment. Anand saw the face. Gray skin drawn tight against bone. Darkened lips peeled slightly from the teeth. Eyes open. Wet. Reflecting no light. His lungs forgot how to breathe. The figure stopped. Its head turned. Not searching. Choosing. The distance between them stretched across the fields. Yet Anand felt the weight of its gaze settle onto him like damp soil thrown across a coffin lid. Behind him, a door slammed. Another. The village sealed itself in. The corpse took one slow step forward. The sound of its foot meeting the ground carried across the still air with a dull, hollow weight. Anand staggered backward. The bundle slipped from his grasp and struck the dirt road. The copper amulet rang softly against stone, a thin metallic note that seemed to hang in the air longer than it should. The corpse stopped moving. Its head tilted slightly, as if listening. The amulet vibrated. The strands of hair twitched. From somewhere beneath the earth came a slow inhalation. The soil along the canal's edge shifted, darkening as moisture seeped upward. Cracks spread through the dry ground like veins opening beneath skin. The corpse took another step. Mud clung to its feet. Where it walked, the earth remained dark. Anand turned and ran. Behind him, the dogs fell silent all at once. The sudden absence of sound felt like pressure against his skull. He reached his house and slammed the door, driving the bolt into place with trembling hands. His chest heaved, his vision pulsed. Outside, nothing moved. Nothing breathed. Nothing cried. Minutes passed. Then, faintly, from beyond the fields, came the slow drag of something moving across dry soil. A dull step. Another. Stopping. Waiting. Inside the house, the floor beneath his feet gave a soft creak. Warmth seeped upward through the boards. From beneath the wood came a slow, patient breath. And somewhere not far from the door, something wet touched the threshold and remained there. As if the thing that walked the fields had arrived and was deciding whether to enter. Chapter 14. The body it chose. Anon did not move from the door. His hand remained pressed against the bolt, fingers numb, as though the wood itself held him in place. On the other side of the threshold, something rested in stillness, not scratching, not knocking, simply present. The silence felt swollen, stretched tight enough to tear. Then the smell came through the cracks. Wet soil, stagnant water, and the faint sweetness of rot. A dark dampness spread slowly beneath the door, seeping inward along the grain of the wood. It did not flow like liquid. It absorbed, darkening the fibers as though the house itself were drinking it. Anon backed away. The floor felt warm beneath his feet. From below, the slow breathing continued. The house inhaled. The thing outside exhaled. Their rhythms began to align. He pressed his hands over his ears. But the sound was not one carried through air. It moved through the wood, the soil, the bones of the structure, and into his own body, until his chest rose and fell in unwilling imitation. A dull thud struck the door. Not a knock. A weight settling against it. The wood bowed inward slightly. Dust sifted from the lintel. Anon stumbled backward toward the center of the room, shaking his head, whispering for it to stop, though he no longer knew whether he meant the sound, the smell, or the terrible synchronization of breath overtaking his own lungs. The copper amulet lay where he had dropped it earlier. It trembled faintly against the floorboards, emitting a thin metallic hum that vibrated through the soles of his feet. The strands of hair beside it twitched, curling toward the door. Outside, something shifted. The pressure against the wood lifted. Silence returned. For one fragile second, Anon believed it had gone. Then the first knock sounded from the wall behind him. He spun. The plaster bulged outward, forming a shallow swelling as though something pressed from within the structure itself. A hairline crack split across the surface. Dark grains of soil trickled down. Knock. From beneath the floor. Knock. From the ceiling beam above his bed. The sounds converged around him, mapping the dimensions of the room, measuring, locating, enclosing. His breath hitched. The floorboards beneath his feet softened. He looked down. The wood darkened, moisture spreading outward in branching veins. The grain swelled, then sank slightly, as though the boards were dissolving into damp soil beneath an invisible weight. Warmth surged upward through his legs. His skin prickled. A numb heaviness crept into his calves, then his thighs, as if invisible hands were gripping him from below. He tried to step backward. His foot would not lift. Panic erupted in his chest. He clawed at the wall for balance. His reflection flickered briefly in the dark window glass beside him. For a fraction of a second, he saw himself standing alone. Then the reflection shifted. A second outline overlapped his body, taller, thinner, head angled at an unnatural tilt. His reflection's eyes opened wider than his own. The air behind his neck warmed. A slow inhalation touched his skin. "You opened the ground," a whisper breathed. His jaw locked. His tongue felt thick and unresponsive. Cold spread upward through his spine, followed by a creeping numbness that tightened across his shoulders and down his arms. His fingers curled involuntarily. He tried to scream. Only a thin rasp escaped. The copper amulet rattled violently on the floor. The strands of hair writhed like living threads. The breathing deepened. His lungs moved, but not by his will. In the window reflection, His posture straightened abruptly, stiff, unnatural, his head tilted slightly to one side. His mouth opened, but the voice that emerged was not his. So warm, it whispered. The pressure in his chest eased. The numbness receded, replaced by a heavy stillness settling deep inside his muscles, not paralysis, but occupancy. His heartbeat slowed. The house exhaled. The floor hardened beneath his feet. Outside, the night wind rose at last, hissing through the Palmyra leaves like dry whispers passing from tree to tree. Anon blinked. His vision steadied. His hands lowered slowly to his sides. The copper amulet lay silent. The strands of hair rested motionless. In the window, his reflection stood perfectly still. Then, with slow, unfamiliar calm, he turned toward the door and smiled.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.
Chapter 15. The Village That Forgot to Breathe. No one in Ban Nong K saw Anon leave his house that night. The wind moved through the Palmyra leaves with a dry, whispering hiss, carrying the smell of dust and distant rain that never arrived. Doors remained barred, lamps burned low behind shuttered windows. Even the dogs lay silent beneath the houses, their eyes open, their bodies trembling without sound. Just before midnight, the door of Anon's house opened. He stepped out slowly. His movements were precise, measured, almost ceremonial. Mud no longer clung to his feet, yet each step left a faint darkening in the dust, as though the ground remembered his passing even when the surface did not. He did not look back. The path toward the fields lay silver beneath thin moonlight. The dry canal cut a pale scar through the earth. Beyond it, the shack waited at the edge of the village like a wound that had never healed. The red talismans hanging from its beams stirred as he approached, though the air remained still. Inside the village, something shifted beneath the soil. A faint tremor traveled from one house to the next. A low wooden creak answered from the temple floor. Then silence returned, heavier than before. Anon climbed the shack steps. The chains that had sealed the door for more than a decade lay slack against the wood, their iron darkened by dampness. The lock hung open, no one had touched it. The door eased inward at the pressure of his hand. Darkness pooled inside. The coffin stood where it had always stood, at the center of the room. Wrapped in faded red cloth marked with protective symbols now cracked and peeling like old scabs. The lid rested slightly ajar. Warm air exhaled through the gap. Anon stepped closer. His breathing matched the slow rhythm drifting from within. He placed both hands on the coffin lid. For a moment, nothing moved. Then he lifted. The wood opened with a long, fibrous groan. Inside lay the body of a Jarn Prasit. Gray skin stretched tight across bone. Darkened lips drawn back from the teeth. Eyes open. Wet. Waiting. Anon leaned forward until his face hovered inches above the corpse. The smell of wet soil and extinguished incense filled his lungs. A long breath passed between them. The corpse's chest did not rise. Yet the breathing continued. From within the hollow cavity of the coffin, from the wood, from the air between their faces. Anon's mouth opened. The corpse's lips trembled. For an instant, the two breaths synchronized. Then the shack exhaled. The red cloth binding slipped from the corpse's shoulders and fell soundlessly into the coffin. The yantra symbols flaked away, drifting like dead skin. Outside, the ground across the fields darkened as moisture seeped upward through the dry earth. Inside the village, floorboards creaked in empty houses. In the temple, the bell rope swayed without sound. Anon straightened slowly. Behind him, the night deepened. The corpse in the coffin remained motionless. But its eyes no longer held their wet gleam. They had dulled, clouded, empty. Anon turned toward the doorway. His posture was upright now, no stiffness remaining. His movements flowed with calm precision, like a man relieved of an invisible burden. He stepped down into the dust. Behind him, the coffin lid lowered on its own with a soft wooden sigh. The door of the shack drifted closed. The chain slid back into place. By dawn, Ban Nong K lay silent. When provincial police arrived 3 days later, Responding to reports of livestock wandering unattended along the highway, they found the village abandoned. Cooking pots remained on stoves. Doors stood open. Bowls of rice had hardened untouched. No signs of struggle marked the homes. No bodies were found. At the edge of the village, the old shack stood sealed. New strips of red cloth had been tied across the door. Fresh gold talismans gleamed in the morning sun. Carved into the wood in deep, deliberate strokes were words that had not been there before. Do not open. The officers left before sunset. Travelers passing the abandoned road sometimes slow when their vehicles roll past the fields of Ban Nong Khe. On windless nights, when the air hangs thick and unmoving, they claim to hear a faint hollow sound drifting across the dark land. Not loud, not urgent, just 3 slow knocks. And sometimes, if they listen longer than they should, they hear breathing beneath the earth. Slow, patient, and no longer alone. Some bodies are buried, some are burned, and some are kept waiting until they learn how to walk again. The village of Ban Nong Khe is now nothing more than empty fields and collapsing houses waiting to fall into dust. No one has returned. No one speaks of what happened there. But the shack at the edge of the fields still stands. Its door sealed. Fresh talismans hanging in the wind. And on nights when the air is perfectly still, travelers passing the old road claim they hear a hollow sound rising from beneath the ground. It is not a cry for help. It is not the sound of something trying to escape. It is only a slow reminder that some spirits are never meant to be buried. And they are still waiting.
Like and subscribe to Whispering Dark Tales for more chilling ghost stories.